Wonderful, wonderful. Well, it looks like we're all set up, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome to this webinar session run by Civismo. Civismo is a free market think tank based out of Madrid in Spain. And I want to thank today's guest, Ryan Berg. Thank you, Ryan, for being with us and sharing your thoughts and your time. Ryan is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where his work covers primarily Latin American foreign policy, development issues, transnational organized crime, narco trafficking, illicit networks, all of which are going to be relevant to our conversation today, which is about assessing the United States' maximum pressure campaign on Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela in the time of coronavirus. Let me give folks maybe a little bit of Ryan's background here. Ryan has a BA in Government and Theology from Georgetown University, after which he pursued graduate studies on this side of the pond, namely the University of Oxford, where he obtained an MSc in Global Governance and Diplomacy, as well as a Master's of Philosophy and a Doctorate of Philosophy in Political Science, with dissertations on the fascinating topic of the virtue of courage, which I hope will also, in one way or another, creep into our conversation as a topic. Ryan's experience includes working variously as a consultant and a researcher, a scholar at development banks, institutions across Latin America and Europe, including Peru, Switzerland, Brazil, where he was a Fulbright scholar. And most recently, and before joining AEI, Ryan was a research consultant at the World Bank. So, Ryan, why don't you let me start by kind of setting the table here a little bit in terms of how Venezuela is dealing with this worldwide pandemic. In a piece that you wrote on The Hill on March 19th, you spoke of a perfect storm, by which you meant that coronavirus has hit Venezuela at a time when the country was already reeling from a number of issues, primarily free-falling oil prices. And in the piece, you write, the conditions have never been more auspicious for the U.S. to strangle the regime and achieve its foreign policy goals in Venezuela. So let me delve a little deeper before I ask you a question. I want us to discuss how coronavirus is playing out, both in favor of the maximum pressure campaign and the ways in which it could also be working against it. Quarantines are always welcomed by tyrants. It allows them to keep people locked away in their homes, primarily those who are most eager to protest the regime. So the young, the likes of which we've seen protest in Caracas for the last few years. And you've conceded in that piece that the pandemic may in some way favor Maduro in the short term, but you also point that the breakdown of the country's healthcare system may expose the ravages that Maduro has done and Maduro and his regime have done to the country as a whole. So that's the domestic picture. And I want to take us out into the international sphere for a second, then I'll turn over to you for my question. On the international sphere, the challenge here, of course, is for America to keep up its maximum pressure campaign in the face of growing calls from the international community to relieve sanctions, to lift sanctions essentially. Venezuela, just like Iran, has stepped up its long-standing campaign to get sanctions relief from Washington. It has even had what I would say is the impudence, the arrogance of asking for bailouts from the International Monetary Fund, which is a majority US-funded institution. In the piece, you write that to relax sanctions unconditionally on Venezuela would not only fail to ameliorate the suffering of Venezuelans, but would also reward the criminal regime for holding the Venezuelan people hostage in such terrible conditions. So, Ryan, can you help us tie all of this together and give us a sense of whether, as many of us hope, COVID can make a democratic transition in Venezuela more likely, more imminent, and if so, under what conditions?
Well, great, Jorge. Thanks for setting the tables so nicely there, and thanks for having me. Greetings to all of our followers on both sides of the Atlantic. I would just add one thing to the very charitable bio that you gave, is that during my graduate studies, I spent 3 very pleasurable months in Toledo, and still maintain very fond memories of the experience I had in Spain. So my personal connection to Spain, I always feel strongly about it. Look, these are really difficult times for the world, but also for Venezuelans. The piece that I wrote in The Hill about the perfect storm, the perfect storm was really about, first off, the coronavirus, right? The pandemic that's unfolding across the world. The fact that Venezuela had already had a very collapsing healthcare system, and the fact that this pandemic is going to strain that system even more is very alarming. The Johns Hopkins University Center for Global Health Security named Venezuela as one of the most at-risk countries at the end of 2009, and this is before the coronavirus hit. So the fragility there in the healthcare system is ever present and very concerning. So, for example, only about a third of hospitals in all of Venezuela, I believe, have running water. Most have it only on a once or twice weekly basis. So when it comes to the very simple thing, such as washing one's hands, which doctors are telling us is key to being able to combat this virus, there's no sterilizer, there's no hand sanitizer, and there's no running water. Soap is hard to come by. So even just basic things to combat the virus are very difficult. Then you come to the fact that the regime is systematically undercounting coronavirus cases. Actually, they've released numbers which purport to show that their numbers are going down since they've first released figures. But that actually might be because the test that they're using is a test that's not very common. It's actually a blood-based test, and it can only detect the presence of coronavirus after about a week in the body. So they're not using the gold standard sort of nasal swab test that we've all seen and read and maybe even experienced ourselves, for those who have had the coronavirus. And so there's a systematic undercounting. There's only one lab in Crux that's processing the results if a coronavirus test is positive, but it's not produced by this particular centralized lab. It's not counted in the official state count. So we have a really complex humanitarian emergency here. We had one before the coronavirus hit, and I think we definitely have one now that the coronavirus is exacerbating it. The second prong of the perfect storm that I mentioned is the collapse in the global oil markets, which was really a product not only of the coronavirus itself, but also a price war that was initiated between the Saudis and the Russians after the collapse of a previous supply agreement. And so you have what has been characterized by many people as the most oversupplied global oil market in a century, and Venezuela is anywhere between 95 and 98% oil-based economy. Much of their revenue comes from oil exports. And so obviously the regime is going to take a massive hit to its bottom line. After I wrote the piece, the US launched Operation Orion, which I would consider to be the third prong of the perfect storm. Obviously, I wasn't able to write about it in the piece, but it's really looking at counter-narcotics operations, which is getting at some of the illicit financing sources that the regime has. So all of these things seem to be moving in concert against the Maduro regime, even if, as you said, in the short term, Maduro may benefit from this because he can keep people off the streets. He can relieve some of the immediate pressure on his government. He can do so with the very important public health excuse of preventing transmission of a deadly virus. But in the end, I still think that in the medium to long term, this is a significant threat to the stability of his government, because these pressures are mounting. And they're not going to go away anytime soon. The global oil market, even when it does recover, is not going to recover quickly. It's going to be a slow process where prices recover on a month-to-month basis. And so the regime is going to be searching for solutions to maintain its stability for a while to come.
Sure. Well, that's a fascinating piece of context that you've just drawn up there, and it's certainly very helpful to know how Venezuela looked like before coronavirus, and how in the wake of the virus it may suffer more still. And I want to just remind our viewers that what Ryan referred to as Operation Orion, right, is the enhanced narcotics operation that the U.S. Southern Command is deploying in nearby the coast of Venezuela in an effort
It's a 22-country operation. It's not just a U.S. operation. It's a 22-country operation, which includes some members of the European Union, including the Netherlands, patrolling for narco subs, for illicit narcotics shipments. It includes a number of partners in the Latin America region as well, such as Colombia, and so it's a long-range operation, but already they've managed to get a couple seizures of significant loads of narcotics.
Sure, and look, that's all very useful context, and I'll use that as to piggyback off of the question of how the worldwide trouble in the oil markets, compounded with sanctions on oil sales, right? These measures that are meant to limit or prohibit international buyers from purchasing Venezuelan crude. I want to segue into the question of how all of that may, if anything, it may, as some are worrying, be counterproductive to the extent that it gives the regime an incentive to turn to other revenue sources that may be more illicit and perhaps even more, perhaps present an even greater threat to the United States. And we've known and heard about instances of, top regime officials involved in narco trafficking and such. So I want to turn here to the issue of Spain, because if you as you and I have previously discussed, Spain, you would think that Spain would be in the front lines of well, actually, before we turn to Spain, although it's somehow related, but I want to, just before we turn to Spain, I want you to weigh in on whether you think that the perverse incentive of having sanctions in fact push the regime to seek revenue in other sources, be it narco trafficking or illegal mining or other sources. Do you think that's a concern? Do you think we should be concerned? And how should we, as we go about this maximum pressure campaign, how can we make sure that the regime doesn't get confined to the furthest reaches of the criminal sphere in spheres that the force of U.S. law may not even be able sometimes to act as effectively? Are you concerned of that sort of guacamole effect?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I'll also use this opportunity to answer the second part of your question from your first point, which was about sanctions and whether sanctions are the best way to affect a political transition at this point in time in Venezuela, which many of us believe is the only way that the Venezuelan people will receive long-term relief, is if there's a real political transition in the country, moving the country back towards its rich democratic tradition. So, at this point in time, the U.S. has heard lots of calls from both Venezuela itself and from other countries in international fora that we should remove or lift some of our sanctions, both individual and sectoral. And I wrote in The Hill, as you mentioned, that this would sort of reward the regime for holding Venezuelan people hostage. I still believe that is the case. I don't think that the regime should be rewarded for sort of not providing for its citizens, for squirreling away much of the money that it does manage to take in, both illicit and licit, into its own personal coffers, and not providing real governance solutions for the Venezuelan people. I also suggested in that piece that I think that there's a better way forward. I think that there's a better way to offer humanitarian assistance, which is gravely needed, desperately needed. 5,000 Venezuelans a day are leaving the country. 5 to 5.5 million have already left the country total. So the pace of exodus is only increasing, and many of the countries in the surrounding region in the Latin American neighborhood need assistance, because they too are also buckling under the pressure of this large migratory movement. But I think there are more targeted ways to do it rather than just lifting the sanctions and trusting that this regime, which has shown no impulse whatsoever to deliver aid in a neutral or non-political manner, to entrust them to do so now in what is probably best described as a complex humanitarian emergency. I don't think that that's a good solution. So some of the things that I suggest are USAID continuing to provide the United Nations with support, which it did in a shipment of about $90 billion worth of PPE, personal protective equipment, that was provided a few weeks ago. OFAC, that is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, can easily clarify exemptions here. So it's important to note that the U.S. sanctions, both on Iran and Venezuela and many other countries, always exempt food and humanitarian goods, always. And if there are any issues of overcompliance, or what we call in the technical literature de-risking, where companies decide, they don't want to bother with this stuff because running afoul of U.S. sanctions is really a pain and can cause them to have their assets frozen or be unable to engage in financial transactions through banks, they can always go to OFAC and ask for clarifications. OFAC should be upfront about clarifications so that the exemptions exist for the purchasing of critical medical equipment, supplies, food, etc. So I think that there are more targeted ways to help Venezuelans while also still keeping the pressure on the regime to reform, to allow space for democratic politics, and ultimately to effect a political transition. Now, to segue into your second question here, yes, we've seen a lot of regime members engaged in illicit activities, whether that be narcotics trafficking or illegal gold mining or any number of activities. This was going on before U.S. sanctions campaign anyways. As you mentioned, it definitely increases the importance of these revenue streams now that U.S. sanctions have managed to limit a lot of the licit avenues of revenue. But like I said, this was going on, going all the way back to the Chavez regime, and so this is nothing new. I will note that when it comes to the illicit narcotics trafficking, one thing that we know historically, and that the literature on this issue tends to bear out, is that during times of global economic recession or downturn, illicit narcotics shipments also tend to decrease because these are these items or these illicit goods cost a lot of money. People might not be using them as much as they would in sort of a boom economic time, and so especially with a product like cocaine, we tend to see these types of narcotics shipments decline in a measurable way during economic downturn. The U.S. has been very much on the front lines of the illicit gold trading. We've sanctioned a number of companies that interact with Turkish companies, with companies in the Emirates to move this stuff. Russia has also touched some of the illicit gold, but this is a really difficult product to identify the origins, to identify. Once it hits the global markets, it's almost impossible to identify its DNA, so to speak, its origin, because it can easily be melted down and removed of any of its identifying qualities, and then put out there on the market and marketed as Colombian gold or as Mexican gold, Brazilian gold, and seem almost identical. So, I am very concerned, to your second point, that there are certain sectors of the illicit markets which U.S. Sanctions don't seem to be able to touch. And of course, we're stuck in this whack-a-mole situation where an entity arises. We sanction that entity, such as Minerva. That's a perfect example of a state-owned company that was handling a lot of illicit gold, and then other entities pop up with a lot of the same personnel simply transitioned over into the new entity. And again, these illicit revenue streams are back up and running. Yeah.
Well, that's incredibly useful. Really to really grasp how these activities, tend to react in the case of a global crisis, such as the one we're undergoing. And I think it's a really important point, and you made it very eloquently in the piece. Why unconditional sanctions relief is just not the way to help Venezuelans, and why if it comes, sanctions relief should be conditional on having the reality on the ground change, be it Maduro leaving power and a number of other things changing in Venezuela. And I think
it's important to note here, Jorge. I think it's important to note that the U.S. government is not saying that there cannot be sanctions relief. The U.S. government is happy to have is happy to engage in sanctions relief in Venezuela, but it's not going to heed the call to just do so without any sort of political reform, without any sort of genuine good faith dialogue on the part of the government to effect a political transition. And in the piece, that's what I'm trying to argue. I think that there should be at least some strings attached to it here as a way to continue the leverage for the Venezuelan opposition to get into to get to the table with the regime to actually talk about what would a political transition look like, what would a return to democracy look like. And these are all, all of the things that the U.S. has laid out in its so-called democratic transition framework are things that the Maduro regime could agree to tomorrow. It could agree to lift prohibitions on gatherings. Okay, there's a public health reason not to have political gatherings right now, but also in principle, it could allow space for democratic politics. It could do a whole number of things that the U.S. government has demanded of it as part of sanctions relief, increase the freedom of the press, et cetera, but it has decided not to.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really key point to make from a public diplomacy perspective, that we obviously the United States stands ready to give ground into lit sanctions if a certain number of variables begin to change. And I just want to pick up on here an irony that I came across, and I think it's really interesting to kind of give this its whole new background. Is this is not only so that the position that sanctions relief should be conditional is not only a U.S. position. When Venezuela went to the IMF asking for a $5 billion bailout, the reason why the IMF turned it down is because its lawyers said, look, we're not even sure that Maduro is the legitimate president, because according to Venezuela's own constitution, Juan Guaido's government is the legitimate government of the country. So even the IMF didn't feel enough of a legal grounds there to lift sanctions. So I think it's an irony there. And what do you think? I mean, to me, one of the things that makes sanctions relief even less appealing, unconditional sanctions relief even less appealing, is that much like Iran, Venezuela has, just as it went to the IMF seeking a bailout, it has peddled theories, or in some corners of the government, some members of the government have peddled conspiracies that this virus, at the start of the virus, because obviously now there's no credibility to such conspiracies anymore, and there never was for that matter. But at the very start of the virus, some members of Maduro's regime were peddling the conspiracy that the virus was U.S. made. So it makes it, it just makes it all very ironic.
It's a difficult space to compete in. They're competing with the Chinese for that propaganda line, and I imagine the Chinese are better than the Venezuelans at pushing that propaganda line.
Most definitely. Well, that's all very, very useful, and I want to now turn, if this sounds okay, I want to turn to Spain, because you've addressed this question of how sanctions may in fact push these rogue regime officials to turn to other revenue sources. And I want to turn to Spain because, like I was saying before, you would think that Spain would want to be on the front lines of any global international effort, coordinated effort to hasten the restoration of democracy in Venezuela. And I just want to remind our audience that our two countries, Venezuela and Spain, are linked in bonds of history, language, culture, migration. You've spoken a lot about migration. There have been very high numbers, in the hundreds of thousands, Spanish expatriates in Venezuela for a number of decades. Obviously, Spain is one of the largest receiving countries for Venezuelan refugees when you take out the neighboring region, right? Colombia, Peru, other countries. Obviously, the U.S. But after the region and the U.S., Spain is one of the largest receiving countries for Venezuelan refugees. So you've got those links, and you would think that Spain would seek to play a somewhat constructive role in this whole effort. But I'm sure a lot of people in the U.S. We've tried to draw attention to this issue in Civismo, and a piece we ran on the national interest. I'm sure a lot of people in the U.S., Venezuela, and other parts of the world will be shocked to know that there are reports of members of Spain's government colliding with members of Maduro's regime. And I don't want to delve too deep here into the details. I would urge people to go check the Valiant reporting that was done at the Pan Post, which is a media based an outlet based out of Miami. So I want to ask you, one of the, as you and I have previously discussed, I've been rather frustrated to see how many Spaniards here have been rather aloof at the whole Venezuelan situation. They don't see how it impacts them directly. I think to some extent they are right in resenting how the political class here has used Venezuela as a political football. Because for many, when the Venezuelan crisis was building up, but it wasn't yet so dire, politicians here in Spain, for instance, on the right, would use it to point to the left and say, look, and the regime that was propping up these far-left parties, such as Podemos in Spain. So it wasn't used in any constructive way. It was used as a political football. So I don't blame the average Spaniard for not feeling too involved in this whole issue. But I want to ask you, Ryan, how would you impress on our audience and the wider Spanish audience? How would you impress on the average Spanish voter that this notion that Venezuela matters and that it isn't good by any stretch of the imagination to have members of our government who are suspected or even known to have colluded with members of Maduro's regime? How would you convey this to a Spanish audience?
Well, the first thing I would say is that Spain is one of the largest receiving countries. I mean, that in and of itself, the migratory movements here are of such proportions that, this is the second largest migratory flow in the world behind Syria and probably on pace to eclipse Syria this year. So if that in and of itself isn't enough for a country that's globally minded and is attentive to its image and position in the world, such as Spain, then I don't know what to say. Not only has Spain received a lot of Venezuelan refugees, but it's also a country that contributes a lot to humanitarian efforts. And this is something that I think for too long has been allowed to be spoken about as sort of a local or regional issue, when this is a global issue. We've got Venezuelan refugees all over the world, and this is really an issue that we need to speak about as a global challenge and not as a regional challenge, because that's minimizing the migratory flow too much. Another reason I would say is that it's connected is Spain's humanitarian impulse, part of the European Union. The European Union has always long been known for its humanitarian efforts, for contributing not only to a lot of humanitarian causes, but also to development. And the EU has been, in my opinion, quite lacking when it comes to the International Organization for Migration, UNHCR joint mechanism, the so-called joint mechanism run by Eduardo Stein, who's a former foreign minister or vice president of Guatemala. The effort has been funded by and large by the United States. There have been a lot of donor conferences in places like Brussels, for example. I think there may have even been one in Spain, trying to drum up support, both public and private, for humanitarian efforts in the region. And I think the European voice on this is distinctly lacking because the funding just hasn't been there. The funding hasn't been there to the same extent as it has been in other humanitarian crises from the European Union. And insofar as Spain is a very important, large member of the European Union, I think Spain should care about the Venezuelan situation from that perspective as well. One of the other things you mentioned is some of the complicity in the dealings of the Chavez before him and now the Maduro regime. Look, Spain is a rule of law country. It should care a lot about regime officials trying to squirrel away money in Spain. And there have been plenty of reports of high-level government officials owning multiple houses in certain parts of Spain. I think particularly in southern Spain. I think Maduro himself owns. We're talking double-digit figures on houses in south of Spain. You have a very embarrassing moment where Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, was allowed to land and stay on the tarmac in Madrid, I think for several hours, and not only that, but she was actually greeted by a member of the government. I believe they had a conversation on her plane. We don't really know what was said, but we're just left to speculate. From an image standpoint, these are all bad images for Spain, but I think perhaps even more importantly, they have a rule of law effect. They have a corrosive effect. We see in Latin America, where the Venezuelan regime is a little bit more proximate, some of the eroding of rule of law and institutions that have happened because the corruption obviously doesn't stay contained within Venezuela. It has tons of spillover effects. And there's no reason that those effects can't show up in the United States, they can't show up in Spain, they can't show up in other places of the world, as indeed they have. A lot of indictments and issuing opinions for individual sanctions have noted the corrosive and corrupting factor that these sanctions are meant to remedy on the local level. So when the U.S. attorney in Miami or in New York issues indictments or statements, reasons for sanctions, it often points to this corrosive effect that a lot of this money moving around and interests have on rule of law.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate you tackling this as a corruption issue more so than a diplomacy issue or anything else. I think Spaniards should realize that it's never beneficial to have government officials collude or deal with members of a sanctioned, corrupt regime. Wherever that regime lies on the political spectrum, this is no longer a political issue. This is a rule of law issue. So I really appreciate you framing it in those terms. And thank you for bringing up this issue of the assets that a number of regime officials hold here in Spain. It's certainly very concerning. I mean, we've seen the United States act very swiftly on property, financial assets and property held by individuals linked to the regime, and the U.S. authorities have been very swift in sanctioning those officials. I also want to mention, just so our audience knows, that there's a note by Bloomberg going back to, I believe, November 2019 that reported on the prospect of OFAC. So again, Ryan mentioned OFAC earlier. It's the Office of Foreign Assets Control within the U.S. Treasury. This Bloomberg note mentioned the prospect that reported that OFAC was considering sanctions on the Bank of Spain because it was found to have connections with the Central Bank of Venezuela, and it was found to be a conduit for regime officials to deposit money there. So again, this is a series of reports that just all go to show that that members within Spain's government and even some institutions such as the Bank of Spain have been all too friendly to the regime, and that's never beneficial for Spain and to its rule of law. So I'm gonna, if this is okay with you, Ryan, I'm gonna turn to our audience. I'm gonna ask our audience to start fielding questions, and when they do send us their questions, we've got about 20 minutes left to engage with Q&A. When they send us questions, would they please tell us their name, where they're from, where they're based right now, and if you have any affiliation that you'd like to disclose. And as the questions come up, we'll begin addressing them in turn, one by one. Meanwhile, Ryan, why don't we turn? I really appreciate that you mentioned this scandal, Delcygate. It was so dubbed because the scandal here, the Delcygate scandal, and it wasn't. I mean, I'm pretty impressed that it's come to your attention. It's certainly very concerning from even a Spanish perspective. A lot of people were very upset and frustrated that a high-level official within the government, in this case the transportation minister, his name is Jose Luis Ábalos, and he's very close to the prime minister, by the way. But it's very concerning to see people at such high levels of the government so willingly cross the line in such a fashion. I mean, this Delcy Rodriguez, who is by some accounts Maduro's right hand on diplomacy matters, she was never allowed to set foot on EU soil. She was sanctioned. She'd been sanctioned for months. So again, you recounted the facts pretty accurately there. This whole notion that the minister went and met with her and spent hours with her, and there's even, I mean, again, some of the details of this may emerge one day if the truth emerges, but certainly what has emerged so far is very concerning. There's, I think, an anonymous source within the Venezuelan embassy here in Madrid told a reporter somewhere that Delcy was carrying a number of pieces of luggage full of money and sensitive documents that ran past customs. They weren't even checked, obviously, because she was accompanied by a minister who was able to have that material just walk past customs. So all these things are incredibly concerning. I want to ask you maybe just one last question before we turn to the audience. We have no questions yet, and I want to encourage again our audience to start filling questions. Do you have any sense of how, obviously, the U.S. is engaged in a campaign of maximum pressure on Maduro, and it's recently unveiled a framework for a democratic transition. So obviously, your goalpost here is a democratic transition for Venezuela. But meanwhile, in fact, for a number of months and recently, another Spanish official, well, he's no longer an official, he's a former prime minister, his name is Jose Luis Rodríguez Zapatero. He has taken the lead in brokering what he calls a mediation effort. He's been trying to bring together members of Maduro's regime and members of the opposition in different parts of Latin America and the world. I think he had held talks in the Dominican Republic, I think at some point, or in other places. But how do you assess his efforts? Do you think they undermine the U.S.'s efforts to use the leverage of sanctions to have the regime make concessions in the first place before any dialogue can happen? What do you think? Has there been much reporting in the States about Zapatero's efforts? How do you assess them?
There's been some reporting, but it hasn't been that much, especially as compared to other negotiation efforts. Let's say the Norwegian mediated efforts in Barbados. My opinion, or my feeling about negotiations, is that if you don't have sanctions on regime officials and also on certain key industries, you really don't give them the incentive to come to negotiations in good faith, because you're not, sanctions provide you with leverage. They provide you with leverage to be able to get folks to come to the table in good faith. And why do I say in good faith? Well, the regime has had no fewer than 5 separate negotiations going on with members of the opposition in the last few years, and so there hasn't been a good faith attempt to resolve some of the political issues and to get to a real political transition. And so there needs to be some sort of leverage to be able to make sure that these are genuine efforts and not just ploys and strategies to use to play for more time or to allow for further consolidation or for the wind in the sails of an opposition movement to die out. And so when it comes to negotiations, I think that it is probably preferred that there be one stream of negotiations ongoing at once. It really sort of muddies the waters to have multiple negotiations going on at the same time. This is already such a complicated situation because you have various factions within the opposition. It's not entirely of the same mind. Of course, it's fragmented, and the regime not only exploits that, but exacerbates it. So having one negotiation ongoing at a time, I think, is extremely important. And we've had U.S. efforts or U.S. conversations about a negotiation. We had Norwegian efforts. We had the so-called contact group which included a number of countries from the European Union and Mexico and Uruguay, who are and who were not officially members of the Lima Group. Uruguay is now a member of the Lima Group because it's had an election and a political transition. But and then the Zapatero effort that you mentioned, you have all these streams of negotiations going on at once, and there's not a common theme coming out of them. It's very difficult to understand what's going on and to ensure that the regime actually follows through on any promises that it makes in negotiations itself.
Sure. That's a very useful perspective, and I just want to. The only thing I care to add to that is that even from a Spanish perspective, a lot of people who were aware of what Zapatero was trying to broker between the two sides weren't sold on it from the beginning. There was a lot of suspicion, obviously, because if you look back, for instance, at Zapatero's time as a prime minister, another scandal that has recently emerged is that his ambassador in Caracas, back when he was prime minister in the early 2000s, has been caught in a scandal whereby he was cashing in, I think, 34 million euros in kickbacks from PDVSA for fictitious consulting services. And you would you begin to worry when you see reports of that about how that money may have influenced members such as people such as Raúl Modelo, who was the ambassador, and others, how the money may have influenced them to maybe even lobby against sanctions or lobby for the Maduro regime in Europe. So it's very, very concerning, and I appreciate you bringing all that together in your answer. We've got the first.
Okay, I think there's a reason why a lot of officials from the government feel comfortable spending time in Spain and even moving there permanently. I'll just give you one or two examples. A gentleman like Alejandro Betancourt, or even Hugo Carvajal's so-called El Pollo, the former intelligence chief for Hugo Chavez, also an indicted official, someone who is said, at least by the U.S. government, to have masterminded the efforts to engage in narco trafficking and sort of as the quote that we often see as a weapon against the United States. He is in Spain. The U.S. has asked for his extradition. He's gone missing for a while. Then he was found. Then the extradition request was denied because it was seen as overtly political. So it's these kinds of connections that sort of irk the relationship and sort of give us pause to think about what might be some of the influences here that are affecting these decisions.
Definitely, and I appreciate you kind of threading a needle there, bringing all of it together, and it's certainly not one statement or one action or one position that Spain has had that has all of a sudden placed it on the wrong side of this issue. It's a number of little things. When you compound them all together, it really makes for some worrying trends. And again, to your point, I think it's a really interesting point to just really, when you put yourself in the shoes of these regime officials, it is just a fact that they see Spain as one of the friendlier havens where they can park their money or buy houses or spend time. Wonderful. Okay, so let's go to questions. Ryan, is that okay?
Yes. Let's go.
Wonderful. So we've got our first question here, and it comes from Washington, D.C. Well, it's a rather general question, but maybe you can speak to some of the specifics here. The question says, "What do you think is the future of interim President Juan Gualdo?" Any thoughts, Ryan?
That is a difficult question. Look, there were supposed to be elections this year, whereby we wouldn't know. It was quite uncertain what the Maduro government would do, whether it would allow for an election on the freer and fairer end of the continuum, or more likely would have a very sort of coercive electoral atmosphere and try to elect more members of its party to the parliament. Right now, Maduro said, "Look, if the pandemic continues, this is a perfect excuse not to have elections." So the electoral future of the interim president, in my opinion, is pretty uncertain because we don't know what's going to happen, quite frankly, with the pandemic. And so yet another thing that the pandemic has thrown into question. I think that in terms of his current and immediate future, the Maduro regime continues with its campaign of what I've called in certain pieces of managed strangulation of the opposition. So if you think of it as, Guaido on one end of the continuum or the spectrum, and members of his party on the other, the Maduro government is slowly but surely sort of cutting small chunks away of the opposition towards Guaido. So it's arresting between 1 and 3 members of the opposition at a time. Sometimes it doesn't hold them indefinitely. Sometimes it does hold them indefinitely. And so it's slowly but surely ramping up the pressure, all the while it knows that the United States government has sort of put that red line out there that if you touch Guaido, there are going to be consequences, unspecified, unnamed consequences, not enumerated consequences, but there will be consequences nevertheless. And so the government has so far not touched Guaido, but it continues its campaign of what I call managed strangulation. And again, this is a perfect reason or perfect example of why the Maduro government hasn't merited the unconditional sanctions relief, is because it would use some of the money from sanctions relief to feed or fund the repressive machinery that it's established. And so one of the things that the government did immediately after the coronavirus quarantine is initiate another round of so-called Operation Knock Knock, which is when the regime's menacing Fuerzas Armadas Especiales, FAIS, goes by the acronym of FAIS, goes around door to door and arrests political opponents. That's not the kind of thing that the U.S. government or the international community wants to be complicit in. So this is a campaign of slow strangulation of the opposition, and I think the coronavirus pandemic certainly throws Guaido's future into question. But I don't think, from the government's perspective, from the Maduro regime's perspective, it changes anything. They've continued to engage in the same behavior and the same campaign against the opposition that they have in previous times. I'm sorry, it's not a very satisfying answer, but unfortunately, the virus has really thrown so much into play.
Yeah, definitely, and it's a gloomy answer, but it's a realistic one. And I appreciate the way that you mentioned that one of the things that we've got to always keep in mind and make an argument, cogent argument around when we hear arguments for sanctions relief is that, look, the way that the regime operates, it's simply fact that whatever additional revenue the regime is able to cash in from eased sanctions, from lifted sanctions, some part of it, and we may not know how much, but some part of it will go to ends that we just don't want to be complicit with in any scenario. And that's, tributes to Cuba, like you said, kickbacks to military officers and a number of other things. So are we good to turn to the next question? And we've got another one on the line as well. So I want to turn to this question from Al McGregor. Al McGregor is asking us, in case of failure of the sanctions/negotiations strategies, would the U.S. government plan a more direct strike against Maduro as military actions? This is the billion-dollar question, Ryan. We were both expecting it. Come on.
Yeah, and it's a question that I get often. Look, I think there's very little appetite here in the U.S. for the use of military force in this situation. I've called it in other pieces the equivalent of Libya on the Caribbean. You have a number of roving bandits, paramilitary groups, transnational organized crime groups, even groups like Hezbollah who have some sort of presence in Venezuela. And so, in a hypothetical scenario, could the U.S. military likely usher out a Maduro government? I think the answer is yes. This is not addressing the question of willingness, but capability. I think the answer is yes. But the real question is not is that feasible, but what comes afterwards. What comes afterwards is really a nightmare scenario where there's not much consolidation or territorial control for the government over major urban centers beyond Caracas and maybe Maracaibo in Venezuela. And so you have this nightmare scenario, and I keep coming back to Libya on the Caribbean, where there are different paramilitary groups, even various claims to be to be the legitimate government, sort of a reification of what we have now, where you have two governments claiming to be the legitimate government, representing the claiming the legitimacy on Venezuelan government. And it's just not a scenario that I think the U.S. government wants to go into. I think this government has really shown that is the Trump administration has really shown an uneasiness, I think, with U.S. military action in various parts of the world. I don't think there's any appetite whatsoever in this administration for any sort of real military action in Venezuela. And I think, quite frankly, one of the issues with our policy thus far has been the continued use of the phrase "all options are on the table." Particularly when the regime and the Cuban intelligence officials who are advising it know full well that this is not true. Look, the Cubans have been living under the threat of the United States. Their island is 90 miles off the coast of Florida for more than 70 years now. They know well when the U.S. is bluffing and when the U.S. Perhaps isn't bluffing. And so when you have intelligence officials speaking into the ear of Maduro saying, look, we've checked the U.S. trigger finger for decades. We think this is we think this is a bluff, and indeed they're right. Then it makes Maduro sleep slightly easier at night, knowing that the operation would require some serious boots on the ground, and that there's not really any legitimate appetite in Washington for that kind of action, especially in an election season.
Yeah. Definitely, I really like that when you have Cuban security officials in Caracas advising the government and advising the regime and telling the regime that, hey, listen, we have here an administration that is really about restraint. Then that's when you really know that even the Cubans are saying that. That's when you really know that, hey, listen, we're not looking at intervention. Let's turn to the next question, if that's okay with you, Ryan. This comes to us from Spain, actually. Okay. So this is Eduardo Blasco. He's asking, bearing in mind Hugo Chavez's rise to power, what policies would you consider as points of no return that we Spaniards should be worried about that may be enforced even after the state of emergency? Well, that's a really important. If I can just maybe give some background to this, obviously remind our audience that our government here in Spain is a coalition government made up of, in fact, led by the center-left PSOE, the Social Democrats in Spain, and they were propelled to power with the support of Podemos, which is a far-left party, which is the party that is known to have had a friendly relationship with the Chavez regime and individuals within Podemos remain rather friendly to some of the officials near Maduro. So I think what he's asking is, listen, we've got this government which is veering to the far left in Spain, and their handling of coronavirus points to, although it's a reality that cuts across many other situations and it's happening in many other countries, but you have a lot of people in Spain, they're, I think, justifiably worried that some of the policies that are being put in place now in Spain, whether it be economically or even in terms of freedom of the press and some other things that are happening that are concerning and worrying a lot of Spaniards. So what do you think? Do you think that these two countries are comparable? Do you think that is it too far? Is it too long a stretch of the imagination to compare the way that Chavez built his regime in the early 2000s to the way that PSOE and Podemos seem to be running the country now in Spain?
Well, I think I'll answer it a different way. I think that it's perfectly legitimate to to pay very close attention to how governments decide to end quarantine and what policies continue and what policies recede with due time as the public health threat from the coronavirus goes away. Right now, we're obviously living in the middle of the coronavirus. Most of us believe that there are very legitimate reasons for much of what many governments in the European Union are doing, but that we can still be very wary of movements such as Orban in Hungary to completely make a power grab. Now, I'm not familiar with all the intimate details of Podemos and some of the policies currently in Spain, but I think that I would generally be wary of any policies that tend to clamp down on the media. Independent media reporting is very important, especially during times of crisis, to be able to criticize government failings and to be able to alert citizens to some of the successes as well on the other side of that equation. So media would be something that would be very big for me. Some of the civil liberties issues as well. Obviously, once, as I said, the public health threat recedes, we want to see the restoration in full of civil liberties, and we want to make sure that when it's safe to do so, that those remain robust as they have been in the past in Spain. That there's not in any way a reduction in rights for Spanish citizens. I would look at the spending issues as well. Make sure that under the cover of a pandemic, the government doesn't begin spending on priorities that are highly controversial and would otherwise be scrutinized in a way that they might not be scrutinized now, given that all the attention and the bandwidth and the focus is on coronavirus. These are the kinds of things that I would say broad-based things that I would pay attention to and use as sort of benchmarks to make sure that things return to some semblance of normality after the coronavirus threat recedes. And if they don't, citizens should, of course, point that out and be loud and persistent in their pursuit of a restoration of full and independent media rights. Spending issues should be scrutinized. Civil liberties, all of these things are potentially at play if governments don't return fully to normal. But Venezuela is so far down the road to democratic backsliding that at this point in time, any comparison to Spain, I think, is vastly overblown, and I think you would agree as well.
I love that you make that very clear, Ryan, because I hear a lot of people, even in my network and people generally in Spain, that are sounding the alarm about somehow this being, the start of the long road to autocracy here in Spain in terms of the measures that we're seeing the government put in place to tackle coronavirus. And I would entirely concur with you that, hey, look, these are entirely different ballparks, right? We shouldn't be making these comparisons because not because, like you said, not because we shouldn't be concerned about how supposedly democratic governments are attacking the virus, and not because we shouldn't be monitoring how they do so, including in Spain, but because Venezuela is just an entirely different, ballpark, and they're too far down the road to dictatorship, and so these comparisons should be taken with a pinch of salt. So definitely,
yeah, citizens should always be vigilant. Should always be watching governments. Should always be somewhat skeptical, and look with a critical eye on what governments of any persuasion are doing. But at this point in time, I think you and I would agree that is highly overblown. There's always the possibility that countries could or governments could make a sort of power grab in the same vein as Hungary, but so far that hasn't proven the case. And so as long as we keep a vigilant eye on things, hopefully that eventuality can be obviated.
Definitely, absolutely. Well, definitely. This we are past our time. That was the last question, and I hope Ryan's answer really addressed Eduardo's specific focus on Corona, and not so much on the larger comparison, but specifically on whether and how we should be concerned about how Spain is dealing with COVID. So I appreciate the how precise the answer was. And I want to thank all of our audience for joining us today. The questions were very engaging. Ryan's answers were, I think, very enlightening and very detailed. So I want to thank Ryan for his time and his expertise and for being with us here in Civismo. Thank you again to all of our audience. Thank you to our organizers. And I want to remind folks to go check out, obviously, Ryan's work on his page of the American Enterprise Institute, and also go check out Civismo on all of its social media presence, which is displayed here at the bottom of the screen. You can check us out on Twitter, YouTube. This webcast will be automatically uploaded on YouTube, and you can go back to it as many times as you want. Check out a web page, and again, check out Ryan's great work. So thank you so much, Ryan, for being with us.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to Civismo for hosting me. I encourage everyone to stay safe and continue occupying themselves in quarantine with good intellectual pursuits. Thanks very much.
Definitely. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Ryan. Take care.